In this video, we're going to discuss the difference between a cap and trade policy and a carbon tax. So both of these policies are intended to address a negative externality, a situation where you have, for a firm, the marginal private cost to the firm is lower than the marginal social cost of the carbon that it's producing. So there's a negative externality. The firm is producing so much pollution, but it's not internalizing all of the social costs of people like me and you. So the firm should be producing where the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal social cost. So this would be our efficient level of carbon emissions. However, the firm is overproducing and is producing at a higher level because it's not internalizing the external cost of carbon emissions. So the cap and trade and carbon tax are both intended to reduce the amount of carbon and get it to the socially efficient level. However, the carbon tax uses a price mechanism in the sense that it's creating a tax on this amount here, the external cost. It's adjusting the price and then assuming the firms will naturally adjust the quantity downward because now they're facing a higher price. Whereas cap and trade, you're not setting the price. What you're actually doing is you're setting the quantity and saying, okay, we're just going to set the socially efficient quantity and cap it at this QE. And then the price will naturally adjust. So the carbon tax is a price mechanism that leads to the efficient quantity, whereas the cap and trade is a quantity mechanism that ends up yielding the efficient price. But in each case, we're trying to get to the socially efficient level of carbon emissions. But there are some pros and cons to cap and trade, and I just want to discuss the pros and cons to cap and trade and to the carbon tax. So with cap and trade, the nice thing is you can set the quantity based on science. So you could say, hey, look, scientists have told us that 200 million tons of carbon is the efficient level, or whatever the efficient level is. I have no idea. But you could set that and say, okay, we're setting that in advance. With the carbon tax, you set the price and you hope that it will go to this efficient level, but it might not, right? You might have set the price incorrectly and firms end up producing more than what you thought in terms of carbon emissions. But with the cap and trade, the advantage is you get to set that quantity and you could do it based on science. Now, as things change over time, so the cost of abatement, that's the cost of cleaning up and reducing carbon emissions, that cost of abatement may change over time. It may become cheaper and cheaper to do that, and so you can adjust the amount of permits that you give out to firms for polluting, right? So if you say, okay, look, we allow this firm to do 50,000 tons of carbon, but now it's become cheaper, so now we'll only allow them to do 25,000 this year. So as the cost of abatement changes, you can adjust the amount of permits that you give out. And a nice thing, too, is that it creates these permits that you're giving out, these marketable permits for pollution. They create a unit of exchange that can go beyond just your country. Ultimately, it could be harmonized internationally where these credits could be traded on an international basis and so forth. And so we could think about a world in which we have that with the cap and trade. Also, if you allocate the credits based on an auction, like if you say, okay, look, here's the amount of, or we're going to auction off the credits, we're not just going to give them out, then you could actually raise money, you could raise revenue. But there are some drawbacks to cap and trade, and one is that, so assuming you don't use auctions to allocate the credits, then you have the issue, well, how do we determine the initial allocation of the initial credits, right? Because we might say, okay, well, look, this firm A, they produced 200 million tons, and firm B produced 600 million tons of pollution last year, so we'll give firm B more credits. But is that fair? What if the firm B, they basically are producing a lot more pollution because they haven't invested in clean technology? And maybe firm A, they're producing less carbon because they've been investing in clean technology. So if you give more permits to firm B and say, well, they need the permits more, you're really rewarding bad behavior, right? So then there's the issue of, well, okay, well, politicians are getting involved, they're allocating the credits, and now you've got issues of maybe they're pressured to give certain credits to firms that back them and so forth. And also you have to set up a market. Right? With cap and trade, we're setting up a market where people can buy and sell, or firms can buy and sell credits. And so now you've got to regulate the market, and there could be issues with the market. The market could be manipulated and so forth. Also, one major drawback to cap and trade is that it can't be used for all types of pollution and stuff. So like if you think about somebody's car, right? So let's say you own a car and your vehicle, it's easier just to say, okay, look, we're just going to have a rigid rule for emission standards for your car. We're not going to set up some cap and trade market where you and your next door neighbor are buying and selling credits from one another about how much emissions. It'd just be too difficult. There's just too many people with too many vehicles, and in terms of heating your home, things like that, it's harder to think about setting up a cap and trade system for that. Now, the carbon tax is easier to administer in the sense that you don't have to set up a market, right? So you don't have to create a market and say, okay, here's this market we're going to set up and people can buy and sell. You just implement a tax. And now, of course, it's not easy to get a tax passed with legislation and stuff, and there'll be arguments over what the tax rate should be and so forth, but it's easier to administer than setting up an entire market. And also, it's going to avoid the volatility of having a market, and firms will particularly like that. But also, a nice thing about the carbon tax, it can generate a lot of revenue, right? Billions of dollars in revenue can be generated that can instead be used on different programs and stuff. So, right, not only by doing this price mechanism of a carbon tax are you getting the socially efficient quantity of carbon emissions, but you're getting that money raised that you could instead then use on other programs, right? You could invest it in R&D for new types of technologies and so forth for reducing emissions in the future. You could do it on early childhood education. You get this money beyond just getting, hopefully, the socially efficient quantity of carbon produced. Now, some drawbacks to the carbon tax, and the major one is that it doesn't actually cap the emissions level. Remember, we said in theory, by using this as a price mechanism, by adjusting the price and forcing firms to internalize the external cost of carbon emissions, it will adjust to the efficient quantity. However, there's no guarantee, right? If you didn't set the tax to the right level, or any number of things could happen, and you end up with more emissions, more carbon emissions than what is socially efficient. And so the cap and trade has a nice thing of you just say, look, I'm just going to set it at 20 million tons or whatever the amount is, and then it's not going to exceed that cap. But with a carbon tax, you're using this price mechanism, and ideally, theoretically, you can get to that socially efficient quantity, but there's no guarantee. And then also, you're not going to, even though it's easier to administer the tax than it is to set up an entire market for cap and trade and stuff, there's still the issue of legislative battles, of people fighting over what the tax rate should be, who should be exempt, and so forth. So really, the important thing to remember is that both the carbon tax and cap and trade are both trying to bring about the socially efficient quantity of emissions in theory, and they can both do that. But the question of which one is better might depend on the particular context, right? For sulfur dioxide, for example, they actually have set up basically a cap and trade, and it's worked pretty well. But in some other cases, you might say, look, it'd be too difficult to administer cap and trade. We should set up a carbon tax. So the ease of administration can dictate which system would be better, because ultimately they're equivalent in terms of what they're trying to achieve.